You've probably been told cannibalism was always a last resort, the desperate, starving act of people with genuinely no other option left, something ancient humans only turned to at the absolute edge of survival, and never once by choice. That assumption feels reasonable. It's also, based on the actual archaeological record, only part of the story, and in at least one remarkable case, not the reason at all. Let's actually walk through what the evidence shows, because it's considerably stranger and considerably more layered than a simple story about hunger. Start with the clearest cases of genuine survival cannibalism, because they do exist, and the evidence for them is genuinely unambiguous. At a cave called Moula-Guercy in southeastern France, perched 80 meters above the Rhône River, archaeologists led by Albin de Fleur uncovered the remains of 6 Neanderthals, 2 adults, 2 teenagers around 15 or 16, and 2 young children roughly 6 or 7 years old, dating to somewhere between 100,000 and 125,000 years ago. The bones showed the exact same butchery marks, the same pattern of defleshing, the same deliberate breakage to extract marrow and brain tissue, found on the animal remains at the same site. Published in the journal Science in 1999, the study made clear this wasn't ambiguous. Someone had processed these bodies for food, using precisely the same technique and the same tools used on game. An even more specific case comes from El Sidrón in northern Spain, where researchers recovered remains from at least 13 Neanderthals who lived roughly 49,000 years ago. Here, the evidence goes a layer deeper. Analysis of their teeth showed hypoplasia, a developmental marker directly associated with periods of serious nutritional stress. Ancient dental plaque preserved on those same teeth revealed traces of mushrooms and moss, and no detectable meat at all. These were people who had, by every indication available, been slowly starving before they died, surviving on whatever bare, low-calorie foraged material they could find. And then, evidently, they were eaten by the group around them. It's about as bleak a picture as prehistoric archaeology produces. Genuine desperation, followed by exactly the outcome you'd expect that desperation to eventually lead to. That's the pattern most people already assume defines the entire subject. Hunger, then a final, grim decision made under circumstances nobody would willingly choose. But now travel forward roughly 85,000 years to a cave in Somerset, England, and the story changes in a genuinely important way. Gough Cave sits inside Cheddar Gorge, and it was occupied by people of the Magdalenian culture roughly 14,700 years ago. Researchers, led by Dr. Sylvia Bello at London's Natural History Museum, conducted a detailed forensic study of the human remains recovered there, bones from at least 5 to 7 individuals, including a child of around 3 and 2 teenagers. What they found matched Moula-Guercy in almost every technical respect. Clear cut marks from defleshing. Bones cracked open specifically to access marrow and brain tissue. Human tooth marks left directly on the bone from chewing. By the raw physical evidence alone, this looks identical to straightforward survival cannibalism. Except for one specific detail that changes the entire interpretation. The cave also contained an abundance of animal bones, meaning food genuinely was not scarce at the time these people died. Whatever drove this behavior, it wasn't hunger. And then there's the detail that makes Gough Cave genuinely unique in the archaeological record. 3 of the skulls had been meticulously cleaned of soft tissue and carefully carved into cups, the flesh removed with precision from the lips, cheeks, and tongue, the eyes deliberately extracted, the resulting bowl shaped and smoothed for use, very likely as a drinking vessel. These are the oldest directly dated skull cups ever discovered anywhere on Earth. A separate forearm bone recovered from the same site carries a deliberate zigzag pattern engraved into it after the flesh had already been removed, cut marks arranged specifically for the pattern itself, not for extracting food. Researchers studying the full assemblage concluded this represented what they termed ritualistic cannibalism, bodies processed with genuine structured care, as part of a mortuary tradition, rather than consumed out of any desperate necessity. Sit with what that actually means. The people at Gough Cave had enough food. They ate parts of their own dead anyway, and they did it carefully enough, deliberately enough, to also produce ceremonial objects from the remains. Cannibalism here wasn't a last resort at all. It appears to have been a considered, symbolic, deliberately performed part of how this specific culture related to its own dead. Which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question. If it wasn't hunger, what was it actually for? The honest archaeological answer is that we can't fully reconstruct the internal belief system of people who left no written record behind. But there's a much more recent, extensively documented case that offers a genuinely direct window into what a non-starvation, ritual form of this practice can actually look like in real time, and it comes with a sobering scientific consequence attached. Until the middle of the 20th century, the Fore people of the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea practiced a mortuary tradition in which family members consumed parts of a deceased relative's body as an act of grief and respect, a way of honoring someone who had died rather than simply burying them. This had nothing to do with starvation. It was an intentional, culturally embedded expression of mourning, but an unrelated and devastating problem emerged from it. Brain tissue, which was primarily consumed by women and children during these ceremonies, carried a lethal, misfolded infectious protein now known as a prion. The resulting illness, named kuru, meaning to shake in the Fore language, causes progressive loss of coordination, uncontrollable tremors, and, eventually, death, with an incubation period that can stretch anywhere from 5 to over 50 years after the initial exposure. Physicians Carlton Gajdusek and Vincent Zigas documented the epidemic in the 1950s, work that later earned Gajdusek a Nobel Prize, and by the time the practice was abandoned in the late 1950s, kuru had killed an estimated total of roughly 2,700 people, overwhelmingly women and children, in some villages leaving behind a starkly skewed population with far more men than women. Because of the disease's extraordinarily long incubation period, new cases continued surfacing for decades after the practice itself had completely stopped. The final confirmed death from kuru occurred in 2009, and the epidemic was formally declared over in 2012, more than 50 years after the underlying ritual ended. Kuru is a modern, closely studied illustration of exactly the kind of consequence a ritual, non-starvation form of this practice can carry, entirely disconnected from hunger, and driven instead by grief, respect, and cultural belief about how the dead should be honored. It doesn't prove what was happening in the minds of the people at Gough Cave 14,000 years earlier, but it does prove, unambiguously, that ritual cannibalism motivated by genuine reverence for the dead is a real, well-documented category of human behavior, entirely separate from desperation, and one that carried real biological consequences for the people who practiced it. Put these threads together and the honest picture looks like this. Cannibalism in the deep human past wasn't one single behavior with one single explanation. At Moula-Guercy and El Sidrón, it was almost certainly survival cannibalism, a grim last option chosen by starving people with functionally no alternative left. At Gough Cave, with food genuinely available and considerable care taken in the process, it appears to have been something closer to ritual, a structured, symbolic way of relating to the dead. And in the Fore people, studied directly and in detail within living memory, we can see precisely what a respectful, non-starvation version of this practice actually looked like, and precisely what it cost the people who practiced it. The uncomfortable truth is that this wasn't always the last resort of the desperate. Sometimes, it was simply what a particular culture, at a particular moment, believed was the right way to say goodbye.